So I will now turn it over immediately to my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Dickstein here at Arihanta Institute, whose talk is The Vegan Evolution of Ahimsa in Action. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. You can see my slides? We're all good. Okay, wonderful. So yes, my name is Jonathan Dickstein. I'm assistant professor at Arihanta Institute, and I'm going to go through a bit of material today. And so here's my email. If you ever want to follow up, you're more than welcome to continue there. Okay, so the vegan evolution of Ahimsa in action, and in this talk I'm going to go into a little bit of how Jainism has moved very much from its traditional perspectives and practices to some new ones in a period of time in which we see even greater harms towards animals and greater fronts for proactive forms of Ahimsa. We just listened to my colleague Kojan Bahanak speak at length about Jain karma theory and how it relates to practices and consumption practices more broadly construed. And someone might ask, how do Jain philosophy and ethics intersect with the global vegan movement? So we're going to take a little movement away from Jainism for a second, talk about veganism, and veganisms. So these terms are often used both in Jain and non-Jain contexts, and I would say now for decades, at times with such kind of detailed precision, and at other times so broadly that it's hard to really understand if we're using common vocabulary. Interestingly enough, in 1945 here, Donald Watson from the Vegan Society is the first one who actually gave a definition for the term veganism. And this was in the Vegan News in May 1945, in which you can see here veganism is defined, and I say here the first time as an ism. Veganism is the practice of living on fruits, nuts, vegetables, grains, and other wholesome non-animal products. And then it's veganism excludes, veganism aims. But in terms of an is, what the ism of veganism actually is, Donald Watson describes it as this practice of exclusion. And this is really the most commonplace, I say to this day, understanding of the term. In an article with my colleague, Dr. Jan Dutkiewicz, a couple of years ago, we talked about the ways in which there are so many veganisms nowadays that it's hard to keep track of what the definition is and what kind of stability exists, and in that sense, what kind of use value it has, right? If we have a word that does not have some kind of stable understanding, then how can we exchange with it? How can we have a conversation without a common understanding? And there are myriad ways in which the term has been interpreted, and these are just some of them. And yet, in an article that we put together on the ism of veganism, it seems that the most coherent and stable understanding of the term still goes back to Watson and goes back to understanding veganism as fundamentally a practice, or in short, what one does, not why one does it. It's true that terms change over time, but I also like to highlight that at the time that Watson was writing, when we first understood the term veganism, terms like speciesism, total liberation, these later more developed concepts and terms did not exist. And then it makes sense why in the years following Watson's definition, people like Leslie Cross and other from the Vegan Society wanted to kind of give it a more robust sense. But I use the term, and I think it really will help us understand the relationship of Jain philosophy and Jain practice to veganism if we understand veganism as a practice. So I define veganism, or I say that it's a stable, plausible, and useful term. It's conduct and not belief or identity descriptive. Once again, it's what you do, not why you do it. And if that can be accepted, then we can understand what my colleague Chris Miller and I refer to as transnational veganism. And this could be transnational veganism as a global practice movement comprised of innumerable, often uncoordinated groups and individuals abstaining from animal-derived products. Worldviews and motivations undergirding the practice may vary, but the effect remains the same: an abstention on the personal level and a boycott on the structural level. So here we're understanding the transnational movement is loosely linked by a commonality in practice. Interestingly enough, there are voices within modern contemporary Jains community that are talking about how much the ethic of Ahimsa needs to be enacted more proactively. And we started the conference by talking about these new opportunities, these new fronts that we're seeing from the Jain community in India and outside of India. And here, Acharya Chandanaji has raised some kind of interesting questions about the relationship between, you could say, the ascetic practice and the inward practice of Jainism, and how we could kind of direct that more so outwards. So some questions that she asks is, why do rituals only focus on individual liberation? Why is the path of seva, this is service, not integral to asceticism? Why divide people on the basis of caste and sect? Why are we ignoring the troubles of the world? Why have we restricted the philosophy of Mahavira to narrow rituals and rules of conduct? So when sometimes Jain dietary practices, and this could extend sometimes even to adjacent South Asian traditions, certain Hindu traditions and Buddhist traditions, is the idea that the focus on veganism or dietary regulations is only inward focused. And in a sense, it's selfish. But when we're talking about Jain veganism, why can't we have both? Why can't what's viewed as an ascetic practice or self-oriented also be a practice of justice? They kind of go hand in hand. So the gaze that goes internally is also one that points externally. So in modern and contemporary period, especially a period in which we see the rise of industrial animal agriculture, forms of technologies, abusive technologies, lethal technologies that did not exist in centuries and certainly not millennia prior, Jains are seeing new opportunities to address anthropogenic, lethal, and non-lethal harms associated with the dairy industry. So I think that there's an interesting question to be had is, what can we say about dairy prior to the modern contemporary periods, prior to the periods of so-called factory farming? That's an interesting conversation, and one I think that is very important to have. Well, we also live in a time in which there's certain forms of mechanized industrial slaughter that are not at all kind of justifiable, maybe according to almost any form of morality. In a sense, it's overdetermined, their wrongness, and contemporary Jains are living in this time, as are all of us. And some authors, such as Catherine Gillespie, has a really interesting book. So these are resources for those to look into about the dairy industry, specifically in the West. And a colleague of mine, Yamini Narayanan, has a recent book, Mother Cow, Mother in India, specifically talking about the dairy industry in contemporary India. And we can just look at these numbers now that actually have inflated more than any other period in history, right? And these are from Yamini's text, recently released book. In India, you have something like over 300 million head of cattle existing at any one time, right? So this is a standing herd, you could say. And when you are consistently using these animals for dairy, you need to consistently bring more stocks into existence, stocks as it were. And the question always became, how can you support non-slaughter of cows, but support dairy if the reproduction of cows is necessary for the production of dairy? What eventually happens to all of these cows? And then you see below milk production by the leading dairy nations between 2019 and 21, and India leading that course, given the number cows. Now, not all cows, all of these cows are, say, dairy necessarily, except the kind of, as Narayanan likes to say, the dairy industry is a slaughter industry in India. There is no difference. The dairy industry is a slaughter industry, and hence here you have about 75 million. This is milch cows here, and then milch buffaloes, 51 million, and then goats, who we could also obviously talk about at length. But I say this just to highlight the vastness. These are what Timothy Morton sometimes refers to as hyper objects, numbers that are too big for us to understand the amount of animals that are consistently being bred and eventually slaughtered in these industries, whether in India or elsewhere. And you also see that because of this vast number of animals, here these are images of cows and water buffaloes, the conditions of transport in order for these animals either to be transported to states in India in which it is legal to slaughter them, the minority of states, or outside of India, is also just this kind of spectrum of brutal conditions that you can read about in Narayanan's work as well, who does field work precisely on this topic. And so there's so many harms associated with the dairy industry, which are some of the intrinsic harms in the process of dairying itself. But then we could also say all these indirect harms that are both lethal and non-lethal. Online on YouTube, Animal Equality India has produced even a video called Deadly Dairy that is specifically about the issue in India precisely, and you can go on YouTube and access this video. Now, in an article co-authored with Chris Miller, we actually looked at the way that Jains are understanding the move to veganism based on the realities of these industries and what are the motivations for it. And this goes back to where I started the talk, in that understanding the motivations within Jain communities for going vegan can perfectly align and dovetail with the transnational vegan movement, so long as the practices are consistent. That is, motivations can vary, but the practice is the same. And we gave, in this talk, 3 cases of diasporic Jain veganism. One was the Jain Center of Southern California, one was the Jain Vegans group, and another, the Vegan Jains, one in the UK and one in the United States. The Jain Center for California, established in 1979, voted 5 years ago to make the entire center vegan. So this understanding that there needs to be a movement away, not just from the typical kind of abhakshas or forbidden foods, but what we call new forbidden food, that is dairy. And Dr. Jaslam Modi at the center cited that there are 4 reasons for why the center needs to go vegan, why it needs to kind of refuse its participation in that system of production and consumption. And it's because of Jain philosophy, Ahimsa, which we covered earlier, because of animals, for our individual health, and for the sake of the environment. Also, there is the Jain Vegans group in the United Kingdom, established in 2008. And if you go to their website, you'll see certain lines such as a desire to help the Jain community transition towards a low ahiṃsā, a low violence vegan lifestyle, to run annual Give Up Dairy for Paryushan campaign during the Jain Holy Festival of Paryushan. And this group also has a robust international WhatsApp group, which I'll get to in a moment. Also on that site, you'll see these new ways in which Jains are highlighting these harms, intrinsic or indirect, to systems of to the dairy industry. And that involves artificial insemination, the killing of male calves, and also the quote unquote retirement and then killing of unproductive cows, so they're cows that no longer have economic use value. But yes, you'll also see other reasons to give up dairy. That is for self-control. So there's a way now in which there's an external gaze, so the ethical gaze, the vegan gaze is turned outwards, but there's also a very Jain perspective that's turned inward about self-control and very much inflected by karma and karma theory. And lastly, just to mention, there is another group in the United States, vegan Jains. And as you can see here, the second bullet point, they consider veganism as a modern expression for ahiṃsā. And this is extremely important. The understanding that ethics and values, traditions, religions, they all change over time. And so there's always this balance between the continuity of tradition, but also understanding that tradition is always adaptive. So in our article, Chris and I conducted a WhatsApp survey of 79 members, and I'm not going to get into all of the details here, but just to give a little bit of substance to end on. And that we got 33 responses from the group, and 18, so this is over half of the respondents to this WhatsApp survey responded that Jain karma theory informs their decision to be vegan. It doesn't mean that it is the only reason why they're vegan, but it means there's a concern for karma that is most likely absent among non-Jains, or at least those from Indian heritage or Indian religious traditions, but this is present in their vegans. And many if not most, elaborated that there's a connection between ahiṃsā and karma. As one respondent kind of very tersely answered, yes, karma and nonviolence are inherently linked. Another respondent, we have learned that if you are violent, you are attracting papa karma. This is bad karma. If you are vegan, you are far less violent to animals and the environment than a vegetarian and attract far less papa karma. I became vegan for this reason. This is an interesting moment here. I became vegan for this reason means I adopted the practice of veganism, whereas there are many, say, vegans and in the vegan community, kind of sometimes I would say gatekeeping or arguing about what quote unquote real veganism is. In this case, there's an indication of veganism as a practice, and here it is very much conformed by a concern for the influx of negative karma. And so this is actually a repetition of a slide that Coach Impanek had as well, talking about the Jain Tattvas, reals. And here we're talking about it flags the ways in which veganism relates to karma theory. And that when one engages in not a limitation, as Chris Miller said, but a choice to refrain or a choice to tailor their practices in certain ways, this can stop, on the one hand, the inflow of karmic particles, because one is no longer participating in the machinery of violence. And also, nirjara, there's a way in which the restriction, or you could say almost a kind of fasting, almost a regulation, causes a falling away or a eradication of existent karma particles. In this way, the practice of veganism, both as the prevention of the attraction of new karma, but also a way to eradicate existing karma, continues from a very old Jain and also non-Jain traditions in South Asia, practices of tapas, or this is a kind of austerity, a way in which one can burn away negative karma. That moment is a kind of beautiful joining of how there is an internal ethic of ahiṃsā concerned with karma, but also how very much it is inextricable from concern with the welfare of other sentient beings. And in this case, it's the welfare of sentient beings involved in the dairy industry that has, up until this point, been somewhat of a neglected feature in, say, Jain dietary ethics. So I hope this is kind of just giving a broad sketch, and in the sense, trying to understand that if we can understand veganism as a practice, first and foremost, then the newly emergent Jain veganism, Jains who have been the pioneers of the most compassionate forms of dietary practice, easily weaves in to a transnational vegan movement that is globally concerned with animals, with the environment, and our personal efforts. So thank you.